Welcome back to Quarter Dollar, the place where ordinary change turns into unbelievable treasures. Today, we're diving into the top 5 valuable quarter dollars that could be sitting in your pocket right now. And trust me, you won't believe the jaw-dropping prices some of these coins have sold for. If you love uncovering coin secrets and rare finds, make sure to subscribe here and also check out my second channel, US Mint Mysteries, where we dig even deeper into the stories behind America's rarest coins. Hit that subscribe button on both channels so you don't miss a single discovery. I've dropped the link to US Mint Mysteries in the first comment below. Go check it out. First up, let's take a closer look at the 1985p Washington quarter dollar, a coin that might not catch your eye at first glance. This particular piece is in extremely circulated condition, and the heavy wear is impossible to miss. The details on George Washington's portrait have been smoothed down from years of handling. The once crisp lettering around the edges is now faint, and in some areas it almost blends into the coin's surface. On top of that, the coin shows patches of rust and pitting, the kind of surface damage that comes from being exposed to damp environments or sitting forgotten for years in poor storage conditions. These scars give the coin a rough texture, almost like little craters scattered across its face. Now, some might look at a coin like this and think it's worthless, but collectors know better. The 1985p Washington quarter is part of an interesting era in American coinage. By the mid-1980s, quarters were being struck in huge quantities at the Philadelphia Mint. And the 1985 issue was no exception. With well over 770 million pieces produced, it was a workhorse of the economy, changing hands countless times in everyday transactions. Because of that, most examples from this year show wear, but it's still worth taking a closer look. The Philadelphia Mint in 1985 did not place a moot mark on quarters, so every piece from this mint can be identified simply by its plain design with no letter under "In God We Trust." While mint marks are often a quick way for collectors to separate rarity, Philadelphia strikes from this era are still significant, especially when they have unique features or are preserved in unusually good condition. What makes our heavily worn and rusted example interesting is the contrast. It's a survivor that shows exactly how hard a coin can work in circulation. Collectors often talk about story coins, pieces that tell a tale through their wear, scratches, and corrosion. This 1985p is one of those. Every nick, every pit, and every smoothed-over line is evidence of its journey. It may have been carried in pockets across the country, spent in corner stores, or rattled around in vending machines for decades. Even though it's not pristine, coins like this remind us of the role they played in daily life. Now, when it comes to value, condition is everything. A 1985p in pristine, mint-state condition can bring impressive prices at auction. High-grade examples, especially those graded MS67 or better by professional grading companies, have sold for hundreds and even up into the low thousands. These are rare because so many 1985 quarters entered circulation immediately and were used until they wore down. By contrast, a heavily worn and pitted example like ours might not attract the same dollar value, but it does hold collector interest. Some hobbyists specialize in collecting circulated coins because they see the beauty in wear. Others look for errors, and this is where things get exciting. The 1985p quarter is known to have produced a few error varieties. These include off-center strikes, where the design is misaligned, and double die errors, where the lettering or design elements show a doubled image. These mistakes from the minting process can dramatically increase a coin's value, even if the coin is worn. For example, An off-center 1985p quarter has been documented selling for several $100s, simply because it stood out as a minting mistake. So, even if a coin looks rough, it's always worth checking carefully for errors. Another factor is the historical context. By 1985, quarters were firmly entrenched in their copper-nickel composition, having switched from 90% silver back in 1965. That means coins like this don't have the silver melt value that older quarters do, but they still represent an important chapter in US coinage history. Collectors who focus on building complete sets of Washington quarters need the 1985p, no matter the condition, which ensures there will always be a base level of interest in these coins. So while this extremely circulated, rusted and pitted 1985p Washington quarter dollar might not bring in big money, it still carries value in its story. It's a piece of everyday American history, a survivor of the grind of circulation, and a reminder that sometimes the roughest-looking coins can still hold lessons for collectors. And who knows, if you keep your eyes sharp, even a worn coin like this could hide a mint error that turns it from pocket change into a valuable find. Next up, let's talk about the 1989p Washington quarter dollar, a coin that might not seem extraordinary at first glance, but it carries its own share of history and collectible intrigue. By the late 1980s, the Washington quarter had been in circulation for more than half a century, and the US Mint was still striking millions upon millions of these coins for daily use. In 1989 alone, the Philadelphia Mint, which is represented by the P mint mark, produced over 512 million quarters. That's an enormous number, and it's why most people assume that these coins are common and not worth more than face value. But as with many quarters, condition, strike quality, and unique errors can transform an ordinary 1989p into something collectors are willing to pay real money for. Now, the coin we're focusing on here is in a slightly fine condition, meaning it's fared better than many that have seen decades of circulation. While it's not pristine or mint state, it doesn't suffer from the heavy wear, pitting, or rust-like surface damage that we often see on coins from the 60s, 70s, or even earlier 1980s. Instead, this 1989p still has some detail visible in George Washington's hair and face, and the reverse design featuring the eagle hasn't been completely flattened out by handling. Coins like this can sometimes spark collector interest because they represent a balance. They've survived circulation long enough to show a story, but they're not so worn down that the details have disappeared. One interesting thing about the 1989 quarters is that, despite the massive mintage, high-quality examples are surprisingly tricky to find. Coins that grade MS66 or higher are considered rare, and those that make it to MS67 are the true standouts. Auction records show that pristine examples of the 1989p have sold for hundreds of dollars, with one gem mint specimen fetching around $1,500 in a top-tier grading. That might not seem like millions, but for a coin that most people think that offers pocket change, it's still a shocking number. And here's the key point. Many of those coins came straight from bankrolls, untouched. The ones floating around in circulation today are rarely found in such fine shape. Errors also play a big role in the value of this coin. Collectors are always on the lookout for double die obverses, off-center strikes, broad strikes, and other anomalies. A double die, where the lettering or parts of Washington's portrait appear slightly doubled, can boost the coin's desirability dramatically. Likewise, an off-center strike that cuts into the design or a coin struck on a defective planket can turn an ordinary 1989p into a valuable rarity. These kinds of errors are the real hidden gems because they're one-of-a-kind accidents from the mint. The slightly fine condition of this specific 1989p quarter gives us a glimpse into the coin's journey. It's not a pristine roll-fresh example, but it's also not a coin that has been abused to the point of being unattractive. Collectors often appreciate coins like this because they're still affordable for beginners, while seasoned collectors may keep an eye out for unusual details or errors. It's almost like this coin sits in a middle ground, common enough for anyone to own, but with just enough potential that it could surprise you if it carries a hidden error. So, while most people overlook the 1989p as just another quarter from the late 80s, those who know how to look closer understand its possibilities. With over 500 million struck, the majority will always be worth just 25 cents. But if you've got one in fine or better condition, or even better, one with a striking mint error, you could be holding a piece worth far more than pocket change. That's the magic of coin hunting. You never know which everyday coin is going to reveal an extraordinary story. Next up, we have the 1994D Washington quarter dollar, struck at the Denver Mint. At first glance, this coin might not jump out as anything extraordinary. After all, millions were produced that year, over 880 million to be exact. But as any seasoned collector will tell you, the true value of a coin isn't just about how many were made. It's about survival, condition, rarity in errors, and collector demand. That's where things get really interesting with the 1994D quarter. This coin was minted during a time when quarters were still heavily used in daily circulation. Debit cards weren't as common. Vending machines were everywhere, and people carried change for payphones, laundromats, and toll booths. So many 1994D quarters were used hard. They passed through countless hands, often getting scratched, worn, or dinged up along the way. That's why finding one today in truly fine condition is not as easy as it sounds. A coin that managed to avoid excessive wear and still shows most of its original details is a pleasant surprise for collectors. Let's talk about the design. The obverse features George Washington's portrait, first introduced in 1932 and still in use decades later. By 1994, this design had already been a familiar face in American pockets for over 60 years. The Denver Mint mark D is placed just behind Washington's ponytail. On the reverse, you see the classic eagle design, with wings spread proudly, clutching arrows of strength and an olive branch of peace. This reverse was used from 1932 until 1998, making the 1994D part of the very last stretch of classic Washington quarters before the state quarters took over in 1999. That alone gives it a certain nostalgic value. Now, let's talk about errors and varieties, because this is where collectors really perk up. The 1994D quarter is known for having a few interesting mistakes. Some coins show die cracks, where tiny raised lines appear across the surface due to breaks in the die. Others have dot of its original details is a pleasant surprise for collectors. Let's talk about the design. The obverse features George Washington's portrait, first introduced in 1932 and still in use decades later. By 1994, this design had already been a familiar face in American pockets for over 60 years. The Denver Mint mark D is placed just behind Washington's ponytail. On the reverse, you see the classic eagle design with wings spread proudly. Clutching arrows of strength and an olive branch of peace. This reverse was used from 1932 until 1998, making the 1994 D part of the very last stretch of classic Washington quarters before the state quarters took over in 1999. That alone gives it a certain nostalgic value. Now, let's talk about errors and varieties, because this is where collectors really perk up. The 1994 D quarter is known for having a few interesting mistakes. Some coins show die cracks, where tiny raised lines appear across the surface due to breaks in the die. Others have off-center strikes, where part of the design is missing because the blank wasn't properly aligned in the press. And then there are the rarer clipped plankets, where a small crescent-shaped piece of metal is missing from the coin's edge. These kinds of errors can transform an ordinary 25-cent coin into something worth hundreds of dollars, depending on severity and condition. Even without errors, the condition of a 1994 D quarter matters a lot. In circulated condition, they're usually only worth face value. But in fine or better condition, like the one we're looking at now, there's more appeal for collectors who want a sharp example of this late Eagle reverse era. Move into higher grades, such as Mint State, MS65 or higher, and you could be looking at values of $25, $50, or even $100 plus, depending on demand and the quality of the strike. The record for a 1994 D quarter in top-grade Mint State sits in the hundreds of dollars, showing that even modern quarters can surprise you at auction. Finally, we have the 1996p Washington quarter dollar. Now, at first glance, this coin might not seem like much. It's a modern quarter, one most of us have probably handled dozens of times without giving it a second thought. But when you stop and take a closer look, this coin is part of an important transition in US coinage history. And even in a fine or average condition, it can be worth checking closely because of the quirks that came out of its minting year. The Philadelphia Mint produced over 925 million quarters in 1996. So naturally, most of them were released into circulation, used in everyday life, and became heavily worn down over the decades. But despite those high mintages, some quarters stand out because of their condition, their errors, and the collector demand they've gained as we move further away from the 1990s. Think about it this way. 1996 was the last year before the famous 50-state quarters program began in 1999, which completely reshaped US coin collecting. For an entire generation, that makes the 1996p quarter one of the final regular issue Washington quarters before things changed forever. Looking at this particular coin in fine condition, the wear is evident. George Washington's portrait on the obverse shows softened detail. His hairlines blend into one another, and the cheek area is flatter than what you'd see on a fresh strike. The word liberty is still clear, and in God we trust remains readable. But there's no mistaking that this coin has spent a long time in circulation. On the reverse, the eagle that once had sharp feathers now looks muted, with the wingtips lacking their original definition. The olive branches and arrows it holds in its claws are also less distinct, a common sign of wear on these quarters. But here's the part collectors get excited about. Certain 1996p quarters have been found with errors and varieties that can make even a well-worn coin far more valuable than face value. For instance, there are repo of double dies, where some of the lettering shows a doubling effect, particularly around the date or the motto. There are also off-center strikes and weak strikes that slipped past quality control, making them highly collectible. Even a dramatic misalignment of the die can send a coin's value soaring if spotted. In terms of price, a heavily circulated 1996p quarter, like this one, is usually worth just face value, about 25 cents. But if you find one in uncirculated or mint state condition, the story changes. In mint state 65, these coins can bring $10 to $15. And at higher grades, they've been known to sell for even more. The real jackpot, though, comes with error coins. Some double die or off-center 1996p quarters have been auctioned for hundreds of dollars, depending on the severity of the error and the condition of the coin. So while this fine-condition 1996p quarter may not make you rich, it's still worth holding on to. It represents the end of an era for the Washington core.